Hello, everybody. We're just letting folks trickle in and we'll get started in just a second. We'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora and the Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia, welcome. My name is Bryce Hinson. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and associate faculty in the Africana Studies program at Texas A&M University. I am also on the Oswald Executive Board and the current Social Media Committee chair. We're all gathered here for today's event, African Feminisms, Critical Knowledge Productions in from the continent, with an all-star cast, as you all know. Real quick, we hope that if you are not a member of Oswald, that you consider joining us. Please go to our website, aswadiaspora.org, to find more information about us and about becoming a member. Again, that's aswadiaspora.org. You may also follow us on social media. Our handle on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter is ASWA Diaspora. Again, ASWA Diaspora. And if you're tweeting or using any hashtags, please use the following hashtags: Oswald Webinar and or African Feminisms. Before I introduce our moderator today, I would like to thank the Oswald Social Media Committee, Lori Lambert, Ana Lucia Araújo, Benjamin Talton, Natasha Duncan, Taisha Maddox, Hennessy Lara, and Andreina Soto. I always say, but they're truly a great bunch to work with. These events do not occur without their contributions and labor. So if you'd like, and actually I would much appreciate it, give them some love in the chat for us. I'd also like to thank the Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia, especially Deborah McDowell, Robert Trent Vinson, which many of you know is our fearless leader for Oswald, and of course, James Perla. They provide invaluable support and material support at that for Oswald. James Perla in particular continues to provide tremendous support that without his help, we would not be able to execute these events. Now, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Juan De Asheville, the Jack and Margaret Sweet Endowed Professor of History and Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Social Science, is a multi-award-winning historian at Michigan State University. She is the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of West African History and co-director of the Christy and Chinua Achebe Foundation. Achebe received her PhD from UCLA in 2000. She's an African feminist whose research interests involve the use of oral history in the study of women, gender, and sexuality in Nigeria. Achebe is the author of 39 journal articles and book chapters and six books, with her most recent being the 2020 Female Monarchs and Merchant Queens in Africa. Definitely go get yourself a copy. She is also an executive board member for Oswald. So please let's welcome Dr. Achebe.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Dr. Henson. Good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, gathered, and welcome to this African Feminism, Critical Knowledge Production on From the Continent panel. It is an absolute privilege to have been asked to moderate this important session, and you are all in for a treat. So today we have gathered a group of incredible African feminist thinkers who will engage in a series of notions and questions about African feminism. But before I introduce them, allow me to take care of some housekeeping matters. I will be posing a series of questions to our panelists, and the hope is that after we have gotten through these questions, we will be able to take questions from the audience. I ask that you type whatever questions that you may have into the Q&A box, and we will attempt to get to as many as we possibly can. I will now introduce our fabulous guests, and I will do so in alphabetical order. Naminata Diabate is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Cornell University, a scholar of gender, sexuality, and race in Africa and the African diaspora and African diaspora studies with linguistic expertise in Malinke, French, English, Nochi, Spanish, and Italian. Her work seeks to redefine how we understand specific forms of embodied agency that determine the neoliberal present in global Africa. Diabate's most recent work has appeared in a monograph, peer-reviewed journals, and collections of essays, including Inca Journal of Contemporary African Art, Research in African Literatures, African Literature Today, Interventions, Routledge Handbook of African Literature, and Fieldwork in the Humanities. Her book, Naked Agency, Genital Cursing, and Biopolitics in Africa, Duke University Press 2020, is a finalist for the African Studies Association 2021 Best Book Prize. Diabate is currently working on 2 monographs, The Pleasure Turn in Global Africa and Digital Insurgencies in Bodily Domains. She presently holds the Ali Mazrui Senior Research Fellowship at the African Institute of Sharjah in United Arab Emirates. Welcome. Next, we have Sissy Jaji. She is an associate professor of English and African American Studies at Duke University. She is the author of Africa in Stereo, Music, Modernism, and Pan-African Solidarity, Oxford 2014 publication, and 2 poetry collections, Beating the Graves, published in 2017, and Mother Tongues, published in 2019. Mother Tongues is the winner of the Cave Canem Northwestern University Press Poetry Prize. Her essays appear in Research in African Literatures, Inca Journal of Contemporary African Art, publications of the Modern Languages Association, New Literary History, and Modern Fiction Studies. Her research has been supported by fellowships from the National Humanities Center, the Schomburg Center, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She will use a recently awarded New Directions Fellowship from the Mellon Foundation to support her studies in musicology, building on training as a concert pianist, just fabulous panelists that we have, for a book on Black composers and poets, exploring art songs as literary commentary. Welcome. Then we have Treza A. Silver Lemanives, who is a proud Cabo Verdean woman, wife, mother, scholar, award-winning professor, and community leader. She was born and raised in Cabo Verde, West Africa, and migrated to the United States when her parents with her parents and sisters as a teenager. Treza is Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Johnson C. Smith University. As an educator and scholar, her research is interdisciplinary in nature and straddles the field of political science, sociology, African studies, and women and gender studies. Currently, she is one of a handful of scholars whose work focuses on the emerging field of Cabo women studies, adding the voice of and stories and experiences of Cabo Verdean women to the larger body of literature on African studies, Black women studies, and Modern African Diaspora Studies. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, Medina Thiem. She is a PhD candidate in history at UCLA. And she is a 2021 Mellon ACLS Dissertation Completion Fellow. She helps organize the Project Archives de Femmes, an initiative preserving thousands of endangered documents belonging to Malian women who undertook anti-colonial and feminist struggles from the 1950s onwards, sponsored by the Modern Endangered Archives Program. She is the author of several book chapters and articles, including Women in Mali, in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History. I am certain that you join me in welcoming our august panelist. Some African scholars and thinkers have had a tenuous relationship with notions of feminism, especially as it is and should be defined by whom and for what purpose. In other words, these thinkers are unhappy with the canonization and elevation of first world feminism over a distinctive and perhaps newer African feminism or feminisms, or however else, sisterhoods, motherhoods, mothering that African women have chosen to define their experience. Therefore, these scholars have rejected the label of feminist. As an African woman, I believe very strongly in the power of naming oneself, of articulating one's agenda. I ascribe to Ghanaian writer, poet, and dramatist Amai Taido's view that African feminism is part and parcel of African heritage. She insists that African feminism is not new and refuses to be told that she is learning feminism from abroad. It is from this understanding that I have always named myself an African feminist. For me, African feminism is activism. It is also a body of ideas articulated by African women to help transform the position of African women and their families in their particular society so that they are not marginalized, but are treated as first-class citizens in all areas of living and being. There is absolutely no othering in this delineation. African women define their own African feminist agenda. For me, there is not one African feminism, but multiple feminisms. And these feminisms do not, in my view, necessarily espouse an uncomfortable relationship with forward-thinking men. In other words, there is a place for African male allies. Like Philomena Choma Steady, I emphasize female cooperation and mothering in my definition. Africanist scholar Obioma Nnemeka has called for a more nuanced, flexible, and fluid application of the notion of feminism in Africa, something that she calls nego-feminism. That is a no-ego negotiation of feminism that prioritizes complementarity and collaboration in a movement aimed at not only advancing women, but women's families. And I must confess, I love her ideas. So this brings me to our very first question. I have defined what African feminism means to me. And our first question is, how would you define African feminisms? Is there an African feminism, or should we speak about African feminisms in the plural? What does African feminism mean to you? And I will pause and let whoever feels so moved to take this on first to begin.
Why don't I start? I would like to start by saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. For me, I saw 17 past midnight in the Emirates here, and it's a privilege to be, with all of you, several of you that I've met in person, and some of you whose work I've engaged, especially Professor Achebe. And I'd like to thank our attendees, for joining us for what I hope will be an enriching and vibrant conversation. And I mean, how can I not thank Bryson Hanson for his stellar logistical coordination? So what is African feminism to me? My definition hinging on four main categories: what it is, what it does, why it does what it does, and how it does what it hopes to do. So in that sense, feminism, I will start first with feminism in general, and then I will introduce the qualifier African feminism. So feminism, broadly speaking, could be understood as a political project, an interpretive framework, and as a political project: social, political, analytic, all those different categories. So if feminism is the political project, the heuristic, and the life ways in which gender-based oppression is the fundamental cornerstone, then feminism hopes to combat that gender-based inequity in all of its forms. Now, for me, African feminism, it is the feminism that pursues all of those goals of gender equity. But its differentiation comes in the ways in which those fights, those battles, those struggles are articulated. So my definition of African feminism is not the one that presupposes African women and Africans for that matter as different from other human beings. For me, African feminism is the one that articulates the specific ways in which women on the ground and academics theorize, fight for gender equity. So I think that's how I will stop, and I will frame my brief intervention. Let me add this. Based on our differences, and we all know Africa as a thing is a fraught concept. So for that reason, there cannot not be but multiple African feminism. That is the given. But I will push that even further to be even more granular, to think about, let's say, Ivorian feminism, or Malinke feminism, or Ewe feminism. And I'm saying this not to again uphold our difference. I'm a Malinke woman from the Ivory Coast. I'm not advocating for Malinke feminism in order to differentiate myself from other women. I am advocating for that in my theorizing so that I can be more attentive to the specific ways in which Malinke women, who was located in the Ivory Coast, but also sometime in Mali, their struggles between an Africanized version of Islam and also how the nation state negotiate those differences. that the position of a Malenke woman in the Ivory Coast is markedly different from that of an Akan woman. So how do you theorize African feminism without taking into account those granular details? So why don't I stop here? And then of course, we have more to say.
Wonderful. Thank you for starting us up so powerfully. Any other ideas? This is just amazing.
Yeah, I think I'll take it up. And well, first of all, thank you so much for everyone who came to attend our panel. Thank you so much to Bryce Hanson, James Perla for organizing this and making sure everything is running smoothly. And thank you for your generous introduction, Professor Achebe. I still can't believe we're actually doing this right now. It's really an honor and a great pleasure to be here. And of course, I agree with what's been presented so far. What Professor Jabate was talking about African feminisms being necessarily having this constellation of manifestations because it emerges out of a constellation of different contexts, be it linguistic, territorial, cultural, political, and so on and so forth. So the way I approached this question when I initially saw it was to try to think specifically about what it's meant to me in terms of, as a historian and somebody who's doing my training in history right now, a specific approach to histories of Mali and of the Sahel region in general that kind of unsettled certain myths we tell ourselves about Malian history, about nation building in the region, and how approaching Malian history from a methodological standpoint and with an interpretative framework that integrated African feminisms, how do you break out some of the narratives that we have in the region that are very strong? So one example recently that I wrote about recently were some of the narratives that we have around anti-colonial struggles and decolonization in Mali in the late 40s, in the 50s, which is a narrative that's usually approached from a very masculinist point of view. We have all these discussions of the fathers of independence, Modibo Keïta, the type of alliances that they try to form. Somehow we very rarely hear about, the many women who took up that fight from various stratas of what was Malian society, even during colonizations. We don't hear about the stories of, like in the 40s, you had a group of women who marched on the Bamako Central Prison to free a group of journalists that were jailed there by the colonial administration. In the 50s, in several Malian cities, you had multiple documented instances of fights that took place in markets among market women who were actually each invested in the various political parties that were taking hold in Mali and in West Africa at the time to lead the fight under the fight for decolonization. And when we read about these fights that took place in the 50s in colonial documents, they kind of discard them as market fights, right? It was these market women fighting. Anyway, they didn't understand what they were fighting about or what they were talking about. But actually doing a more fine-grained analysis, you realize that these are women who were engaged in these political movements, who had very strong political ideologies. And those are the reasons why these tensions became so strong among them that you see these fights happening here and there. There's many other examples of, workers' unions movements in the 50s in Mali being led by women, etc. And those are all examples from that decolonization era.
Mm-hmm.
How by the time independence comes and Mali emerges as an independent nation state, a lot of that actually vanishes, right? Because a lot of these movements that are led by women must now be subdued to more fit into the mold that the leaders were creating at the time and the vision that they had of what Mali as an independent nation state should be. And so, when you read these stories, you wonder, what would have been these women, what would have been their visions of a post-colonial African future? How would it have differed from, what we ended up with, what we ended up doing? So yeah, I zoomed in a little bit, but I guess, yeah, in that case, what African feminisms has meant to me in that very particular context, it's a method for doing African history and for breaking out of some of the narratives and some of the stories that we tell ourselves in various national environments about, how we came to be.
Wow. A method for doing African history. Thank you.
You know, it makes sense that I continue that conversation because that, you know, just sort of to your point, Professor Thiam, the whole notion of, you know, the role of women in the colonial struggle and even beforehand. So let me just say thank you to the team ASWAD and for all of you who are here, those who are listening to us. I really appreciate you and for giving me your platform. But to me, if I, you know, broadly speaking, if I can say that African feminism means to me, and there's this not global, but there's this broader and more detailed context, having been born and raised in Cabo Verde and my work centering around Cabo Verdean studies, I could say that broadly speaking, I'm looking at dismantling African feminisms as the dismantling of all oppressive structures. And those could be the colonial structures, the patriarchy and the white supremacy that that continues to perpetrate just really, you know, that continues to perpetrate all of these ills towards women and those who consider themselves women. But also one of the things that I appreciate in African feminisms in the plural is the fact that we can also talk about the specificities, as Professor Diabate has talked about. We are not looking to create differences, but we're looking to shed light and give light to specificities. What makes the struggle what it looks like in Mali? What makes the struggle look like in Cabo Verde and in any country that we bring? So when we talk about specifically about our countries or particular regions, we are being specific because we need to know how the cultural realities of that particular location play into the feminism. So I'm more interested in the African feminisms that actually don't use the word African feminisms, because so many of us actually are like put off by the F word, particularly in the Cabo Verdean society, the way that feminism has been played out. There is lots of feminist, African feminist discourse and activities without the use of feminism, without the use of the word feminism, because it has been given a bad rap. And so my feminism in particular tends not to use feminism when I do my work, particularly in the community, because what I don't want to do is alienate the communities in which I'm in conversation with. And so if it means carrying on the work without saying the word, then that's what it means. And so that's the kind of feminism that I'm interested in, the ones that move our humanity forward without being too focused on what academia says that we must be able to identify. And I definitely think there needs to be African feminisms. I think that goes without saying.
Wonderful.
I can add, and I join everybody in thanking our organizers and Professor Achebe to be introduced so generously by someone we all admire. Is very meaningful. And I think also the other panelists, this is, you know, really what we want to talk about, and so rare to have so many perspectives. So I think I echo as well as learn from what everybody has said so far. And I think the other things that I would add, one is kind of using some of what already Professor Lima Neves was saying, in that feminisms, African feminisms are dedicated to the realization of the full human rights of women and of all people on the African continent, because what we have an understanding of is the consequences of various oppressions and denials of human rights. And I think of those as everything from the right to clean water to having one's identity, one's national identity, et cetera, et cetera. So that when we are serving a feminist purpose, it is a liberationist purpose from the perspective of women not just those of us in academia, but more particularly those who are in non-elite positions, particularly women who raise the food and the children that sustain our present and our future, and those who do all kinds of labor that goes invisible, right?
Yeah.
I think I loved the way that Professor Lima Neves also included in her introduction that she's a proud mother, a proud wife, etc. Because I think what we can bring is our full selves, because that's also how we know the full context and texture of where in our own societies we need to see liberation more fully realized. And I think that's why we see people like Wangari Maathai, who were leaders in fighting for environmental justice and climate change. And it's also why reclaiming these stories of the past are so important. So just as Professor Cham was saying about Mali, in Southern Africa, we have the histories of women who were at the core of religious innovation, for example. So Charlotte Maxeke, who brought the African Methodist Episcopal Church to South Africa, which became one of many important religious sustaining energies for the anti-apartheid movement in its predecessors, right? So, and Nokutela Dube, whose grave was unmarked in South Africa for almost a century, even though she was the partner of the first president of the ANC, right? So we need those stories in order to be able to speak with confidence and authority about our present. I think about in recent times, the Women of Zimbabwe Arise, which was one of the really important movements to stand up against political repression. And those women were brave enough to march when under a banner of more general protests, there wouldn't have been the same kind of courage. I think that's what Professor Jabate is showing us in her amazing research. And we congratulate her for Naked Agency, and thank you for the book. And then the last thing I just want to say for now is, this is also where artists and poets and musicians also have a really important role, because these are the people who can imagine different worlds. So I think about Angelique Kidjo, right? Somebody who has such charisma and range and can speak to far more people than academics will ever speak to, you know. And that's really important. The way that she takes joy and power in her body and takes up space, and people memorize her words, right? We all learn something like Malaika, and to speak to women with that kind of tenderness and pride and honor. I think about one of my beloved cousin sisters, and even our languages, a word like cousin sister, the habit or you know, practice in Shona culture, for example. She's my distant cousin. I don't know how we're exactly related in English, but she's my cousin sister. She calls me the mother of her children, and the same for my kids, even though they're in Zimbabwe, I'm in Durham, North Carolina. But anyways, she's a filmmaker who made a really powerful film sponsored by NGO, but NGOs have a place in all of this, right? And it's called The Axe and the Tree, a documentary about the ways in which political violence during the elections, I think they were 2008, 2011, I can't remember exactly which elections in Zimbabwe, but where sexual violence was used as a tool of political repression. And she developed the relationship with an elder, a woman who had been victimized in this way, because we know how to relate across generations, right? We know how to listen with a kind of respect, because we're taught that in so many African cultures. It's a really bedrock value, right? And so not just through that cultural context, but also her skill and gift as an artist and a filmmaker, but she was able to tell a story about a movement for restorative justice there. And I think that big concept of restorative justice is a feminist concept because the understanding of what feminism is this full realization of human rights. So when we say sometimes it's strategic not to use the term feminism, we're practicing feminisms in our contexts that are both locally strategic and of global significance, I think. So those are some of the things I can add. It's a wonderful question. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. I've heard such amazing things about dismantling oppressive structures, a method for doing history, reclaiming.
We are frozen for the moment, but perhaps we can continue. Professor Achebe shared some
Thank
other
you.
questions. But here she is. You're on mute.
I was muted, and I said all of that and I was muted. Sorry about that. I was sort of summing up what I heard about African feminisms, this thing that helps us dismantle oppressive structures, a method for doing history, reclaiming the stories of the past, a vehicle by which women can speak or sing, right, and be heard. This whole idea of using feminism to move humanity forward, a full realization of human rights for everyone, not just for women. So thank you. And I think that is a really good segue into, asking our panelists to tell us just a little bit about your own entry into African feminisms.
I guess I can start. I can say that an intentional entry was going into, meaning the entry to feminism before I knew what feminism was, or that my grandmother was a feminist, or that my mother was a feminist, was wanting to chase my aunts in Cabo Verde growing up, because they played football, soccer, they played basketball, they played handball, and every weekend wanting to chase them to just be their little tail wherever games they wanted to go to, because I thought that was so amazing, that was so cool. And so that is my earliest memories of thinking that, wow, like there are superheroes, like this is amazing. Look at all these people who come to the stadium to watch them. And having played for the local teams, as some of you may know, Cabo Verde is a group of islands, 10 islands. So they played for our island's team. And to me, that was such a big deal. And intentionally, if we're talking about, wow, like, okay, so now I know I'm a feminist, and okay, this is all messed up. Like, what is going on here? I would say graduate school at Clark Atlanta University, a historically Black college and university, where I started to notice the ways Cabo Verdean women were either rendered invisible in literature, or the literature in English. There was not a lot written in English, given that Cabo Verde's language, not maternal language, our maternal language is Creole, but our colonial language is Portuguese. And so much of our history is written from that perspective. And as many of you have said, and it's sort of a post-colonial history, as if history did not exist before, as if my grandmother and her friends were not walking to the markets and gossiping or telling each other the local news, as if women weren't thinking about ways that they could talk back to the different structures that were keeping them oppressed. And so, and most importantly, just popular culture on how, being at the club, for example, because, I was young, I still am young, but, going to the club and folks thinking that they could, talk to us any kind of way. Oh yeah, I've heard about your Cape Verdean women, island girls. Oh, what have you heard? And all of the video vixens, the sexy everything. I'm not saying that there's something wrong with that. I'm just saying that that was the prominent vision or perspective, how we saw Cabo Verdean women in popular culture, and wanting to diversify that. So, I go to the club, I think I'm sexy, but then I'm also educated, and I really care about what happens to my communities, whether in the United States or in Cabo Verde. So there's all these different sides of me that I need the world to know about, and that I was like fiercely fighting for. Like, I'm not only African, I'm Cabo Verdean. And so there's all these, these intersectional identities that I wanted the world to know. I didn't want to be put in one box.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I would say that in graduate school was when African feminisms, where I wanted to talk back to those, as Bryce said here in the box, in the chat group, the controlling images of what it meant to be a Cabo Verdean woman.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Sure, I can follow on. So I grew up in Zimbabwe, and I was born before independence, actually, so not so young. Although we were late to the independence.
I was going to say you were late to independence.
Yeah.
That doesn't really.
Yeah. So in any case, I can say a few things. They're all very personal. So first, my mother's actually from Ohio, and she went to Zimbabwe during the war as a missionary. With the United Methodist Church to teach math education. So training math teachers for what everybody could envision was going to be an independent country eventually. So as I was thinking about this, obviously there is the principle of mothering and the ways in which across generations is not the only metaphor, but it is a very important one. Across generations, relationships really structure our understandings of self. And so I was asking myself, what kind of African feminism can somebody who is not from Africa produce? And in the case of my mother, who is somebody who really inspires me to this day, she was a principal at this Methodist college. And she always still talks about who actually happens to be the father of the filmmaker I was saying, Rumbi Katedza. So her father was the person who preceded my mother in this leadership role. And my mother always talked about the vision for Black Shona people and other African people within the country, but where we were living, it was Shona people taking up those reins of leadership. And she eventually wrote a primary school textbook series, grade 1 to 7, where all of the examples were from Zimbabwe. All the names of the kids doing their word problems, etc., were Zimbabwean. And really, she, along with my aunts, both my blood aunts and then her adopted family, who were also Shona, were educated people. Their fathers, for the most part, were the ones who advocated for them to have full access to an education. So I think for many women who have access to kind of to the formal institutional educational system, we have to acknowledge that many times it's their fathers who have also been feminists in opening those doors. And I could talk more about other family members, some of whom, like my grandmother, was what we call a peasant farmer. And she raised the food that she sold, and also, for example, the groundnuts that she ground on stones so that my father could put that peanut butter on sandwiches to sell by the side of the road to be able to go back to school. They had no other sort of wealth except for land that they raised. So her sheer hard work and her vision that there was a place for, for scholarship that was really important, even though it would take her children away from her own path. That was another form of feminism, to use those resources and knowledge. We don't talk about agricultural knowledge, for example, as well as labor. But then, of course, teachers, and I had the incredible privilege. My parents worked at the University of Zimbabwe, and Michelle Mugo was in Harare working at University of Zimbabwe in exile because of her her creative work, her plays that had challenged the Kenyan government. So she's the first person who read a poem that I'd written and critiqued it in high school. It's one thing to show somebody something and feel proud of it, and a lot of people can sort of pat you on the head. In America, I'm doing it to my own son, but we always praise people as if it's some wonderful thing that they've done. But I think many people will tell you, I myself feel like I'm not enough of an African mother in this way of like, what have you done? No, do it properly, right? And so Michelle read the poem and she said, why did you use this word here? And I had to think about it. And the word I'd chosen, to this day, I feel embarrassed, but I was a high school student and I'd had a very prolonged education, but I'd used the word pikanini to describe a poor African kid. And she said, why is that word there? And she helped me to understand the history and the exploitation and the denigration embedded in this term that I'd grown up hearing and not understanding. Just it washed over me. And then when I went to college, Oberlin College, that Ama Ataidu, who's already been invoked here, was the first professor of African literature I had. And she taught a class on contemporary African women authors. And it was the first time, even though I had grown up in Zimbabwe, that I was reading a whole set of African women writers. And let me tell you, if you read Mariama Ba and Buchi Emecheta and Bessie Head and Zizi Dangaremga, and I could go on, in one class with someone like Amate Du, and you don't come out as an African feminist on the other side, I think you were, sleeping for the whole semester. So, but what I can say is literature and these family models really shaped me. And that's maybe why I really think about the role that artists and that kind of work has for helping us have a different vision of the world.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to like to piggyback on what has already been said. But before I go into my entry into feminism, why don't I just give a huge kudo to Madina Thiam. Unearthing those and preserving those stories. And I also say there needs to be more work done about women and their roles in empire building or the onset of colonialism. And I think, Professor Achebe's work speaks to that. And I think there's more to be, especially in the Sahel, the Malay world, because when we think about the Epic of Sunjata or the empire, work come up about the role that women played in the empire. So there were not just queen mothers and princesses, they were also advocating for gender equity. So work needs to be done in that area. And talking about women artists, Sisi, as we were just talking, I could not stop by thinking about Umu Sangara, from, and then I mean, a week ago, I was reading about 10 albums that changed women's rights, and Umu Sangare was part of those artists. I mean, it was mainly American. It was a list made by an American, scholar, but Umu Sangare, I mean, I can see how my nieces and aunts are all have grown up to be, more vocal advocates by listening to Umu Sangare. So, talking about artists. Okay, my entry into feminism, I think if we think about it as an interpretive framework, I entered African feminism when I was in graduate school, using it, in its academic sense. But as you have said, being a feminist was part and parcel of growing up.
Yes.
A Malenka woman, where Islam and some of its probably misunderstood precepts dominate, how girls are treated. I was born between 4 boys, 2 older brothers and 2 younger brothers. So now I was the only girl and the firstborn girl. And some of you may understand the burden, that comes with that. So as long as I could remember, I was always outraged that my brother had to go out to play soccer, to watch TV, and I wasn't allowed to do that. One, somebody was going to get me pregnant. And my mom was invested in equipping me with all kinds of skills, because life, as a woman is going to be challenging. So you better be ready. So I need to frame you and prep you for that. So I need to be hard on you. So I was the one always doing the house chores when my brothers were playing. I didn't go to school. One, I did not know to go to the US to understand that these were not okay. So this form of rebellion that I have developed over time didn't because I was, exposed to Simone de Beauvoir, because coming from a French and Francophone, those are the texts that you primarily get exposed to. So one, I did not want to get pregnant because I did not want to get married off. That's what was my dad's. Second, I didn't want to get married off and have children because I understood, my understanding of, mothering was one that was oppressive. So my whole life and my whole academic journey and professional journey has been informed by proving my parents wrong, that girls could do and should be different. Not in terms of how they should be treated. No, let me rephrase this. That girls should not be treated differently as boys. That was what my whole life, academic and professional life, has been about. Proving them wrong, that treating me differently was not okay. So, based on the work that I do today, I think of myself as a feminist. I support siblings, female cousins, extended family members. I'm always able to say, do you have your birth control? No, my husband doesn't want it. I'm like, oh no, I'm calling him up. You need your control because you less than 30 years, you have 5 children. And oh no, stay out of this because they will say that you're a wife. I'm like, you know what? I need to stand up for what I believe in. So both in academia and outside, I'm invested in changing the lives or inspiring changing the lives that I can't.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I want to be mindful of time. I guess there were multiple entries, but I just zooming in on one specific thing, which is in my work, because I did not enter my graduate work thinking I would, I had some ideas about what my project would be. Otherwise, obviously that switched around a lot. But overall, I'm very interested in stories of migrations in the Sahel, because it's one thing that structures the region a lot. Stories of migration and freedom seeking. And there was definitely that moment in the work where you realize, I mean, it's almost cliche to say, but that you know, it's so much easier to access these histories of migrations, of people who moved around, who built networks, etc. When it comes to men, especially when you're looking at, you know, the colonial archive, but also just family archives and family history. A lot of the work that I do is like, you know, just going around and talking to people and like poking things around in Bamako. And it's always the same histories that will, and stories that will come up of people who have migrated, people who have moved, this and that. And so there was definitely a moment where there was a deliberate turn, right, in the work where I was like, we need to, if I don't more deliberately go look for these stories, I'm not gonna just stumble upon them. And one way that I tried to approach this, because it could be difficult to access, was just incorporate the stories of women in my own family, which was also a wonderful way of, you know, getting to know more, getting to spend more time, just going to sit with older relatives and just spend a lot of time talking with them and trying to understand these things. And that helped like reveal, I think, some of the most interesting part of like what migrating in the Sahel and what trying to break out of oppressive systems means in general for everyone, by taking this entry point of like, you know, women's histories. So I ended up, you know, incorporating one of my aunts in my dissertation. I ended up incorporating the story of one of my great grandmothers that just emerged from like these more deliberate questions, right? And then another entry point that I want to highlight, also because we're talking about our teachers, I really want to shout out Professor Nimata Blyden, that I had the good fortune of, you know, working with as an undergraduate student. And I think as Ceci was saying earlier, I think if you took certain class with Dr. Blyden and don't get out of there, you know, with your thinking really changed, it means you've missed out on something. Another important aspect of that, because this was, I did my undergraduate studies here in the United States, was that was for me one of the first entry points into Anglophone writings and accessing African feminisms from other parts of the continent that I previously just didn't have access to because I just didn't have the language. And that's something that I probably will touch on it a little later in the panel, but like translation has been so important in that sense, because there's so much that like a lot of us don't access from many parts of the continent just because of that basic issue of language. And so that's something that, you know, for sure, being Dr. Blyden's student opened a lot of doors for me in that sense.
Wonderful. My first, I think, entry into feminism was maybe when I was 6 years old, when I was protesting the injustice of the fact that young boys or men do not have to change their names when they get married, and women do. And I remember both parents saying to me, explaining to me that was a product of British colonialism and missionary encroachment. So when panelists talk about individual feminisms, right? So my evil feminism means that I keep my name. And I remember from that time, 6 years old, I remember saying to both parents, I am not taking any man's name. It's not happening. And so, you know, I had never really thought about it until you all started, you know, sharing stories of the very first time. And that's a time I think I can point to, you know, that really just got me thinking about some of these injustices that you all have mentioned. Anyhow, let us segue into really speaking about the evolution of African feminisms, right? So we have this incredibly talented panelist of African feminists that cut across generation and time. And so what I would like to do now is to ask you to speak about the evolution of African feminisms across the generations, right? And when I think about that, I am reminded of Amina Mama, for instance, her writing about an African feminist thought, of the aforementioned Obioma and Nemeka writing about nego-feminisms, and of the more recent scholars who highlight an African digital or cyber feminism, right? Some scholars have also argued that African feminisms have evolved from being much more radical to being more inclusive. And so I just want to hear your thoughts. Do you agree? What is your assessment of the evolution of African feminisms across generation and time?
I can start with some things, and they won't really be historically organized, but I think about one really recent controversy, the exchanges between Chimamanda Adichie and Akwaeke Emezi. And first I want to sort of start with Chimamanda Adichie pre her exchanges with Emezi, public ones, in that you know, Purple Hibiscus, which makes both a strong critique of domestic violence and also gives us an image of university women and, you know, the model of African women as intellectuals, I think, throughout her career has been really an important voice for African feminism. And in terms of thinking about the ways in which that also extends to a global context, we can think about how her work and work of someone like the Somali poet Warsan Shire has been taken up by Beyonce. And again, you know, this very wide circulation of a principle of African feminism in the sampling, say, of Adichie's voice. So we can, you know, and she, I think, is the only African author to be on the cover of Ms. Magazine, right? So to have established that it's not a question whether or not she's an African feminist, but we have come to a point where the questions of the right to diversity of sexualities, non-binary expressions, etc., is a really key part of the, say, the vanguard of thinking about equality and equity. And so her exchanges with Akwaeke Emezi, who is writing about trans characters as a non-binary transgendered person, and really challenging the fundamental assumptions of difference as a binary, I think is very vital. The arguments, the fights, the struggles across generations are really important, and not crisis moments, except in the sense of crisis as you know, in its Greek root. And I, you know, I give my nod to Naminata Jabata here because I know that her expertise goes into these kinds of linguistic nuances. But in any case, you know, critical judgment, that's the root of crisis, right? So these are important junctures where there are multiplicities again. Those feminisms are plural, those liberatory movements are plural, right? So there's a place and a vital place for the work that someone like Emezi is doing in critiquing a version of feminism and womanhood that is determined by biology, right? I don't think that it's an either or. And I personally, I don't think that it's possible for it to be anything except a struggle, because one of the points that we were making in terms of the Ivorian, Malian, Cabo Verdean, Zimbabwean feminisms, plural, is that these are located, right? And there's a dimension of what Emezi is saying that is because of a global diaspora, worldwide African diaspora, where those possibilities are possible and accessible. But we also, I think, have to be able, when we look at the narratives that we're reclaiming, to look for narratives and examples and precedent for the fluidities of gender and the fundamental stories those are. So my totem in Zimbabwe, every family has a totem passed by your father. And indeed, you don't change your totem just because you marry somebody of another totem. I, for the rest of my life, will be a zebra, Tembo Vanyemba. Vanyemba is the praise name for women in the zebra line. And that figure, Vanyemba, who I've written about in this book, this poetry book. I didn't put it there to praise myself, but to say also that this is the artwork of Lucia Namu, a beautiful artist and a Ghanaian friend of hers who's the figure there. So saying too many things here, but that collaborative dimension is really important, I think, in the arts. But coming back to the figure of Vanyemba, whatever the name that they would have chosen for themselves, is remembered as a woman who had a penis. And that was discovered, and they were the subject of murder. They were murdered by someone who had assaulted them, a chief in that area. And that chief, when he realized what he had done, surrendered the land to the brothers of Vanyemba. So here we have a figure who was not biologically just a woman or just a man. How they would have been named in the time, we don't know that in relation to this question of translation. But to this day, they are honored. I identify as Vanyemba. Part of the praise poetry of Vanyemba is that you can kick with your teeth, with your mouth, that you are, a strong person. And that piece of seizing our past in order to say, this also is part of the evolution, right? That in a generation before, that would not be the interpretation because we wouldn't have the language or the movement, et cetera, of transness, right? But there's space for that as well as for other traditions and understandings. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Sissy. In the interest of time, maybe could I ask for maybe one more engagement with this particular question? Because I know we have 3 more questions, and I do want to make sure we get into the question and answer. So I don't know who feels moved to contribute to this one. Yes.
Well, I raised my hand, so I'll be brief. I'll say that if we're talking about progress, or when we're talking about these different feminisms, prior historically, or those more contemporary times, whether online or offline, I think I agree with Professor Jaji in that it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think they can be in conversation with each other and they can coexist. So when I think about, for example, in the case of Cabo Verde, there are more Cabo Verdeans outside of the country than there are in the country. So you have 500,000 Cape Verdeans in the country, and then the diaspora is over 1 million people living on mainland Africa, as well as Europe and North America and other places. The diaspora is always in conversation with the homeland and vice versa. And the diaspora locations are also in conversation with each other. So social media and other digital platforms, when we talk about WhatsApp and Facebook or your Vibers, there's that learning component, right? So we're not just talking about academic spaces or literature, but then we're talking about the learning that also is happening on social media. And the very expensive identities and feminisms that sort of grow out of that, right? And so we can't just say one or the other because it is becoming more nuanced, and especially when we're talking about gender identities and how that is perceived and the growth and the education that exists within the diasporic spaces. I think that there's always room for all of them to coexist. And if we go back to the main idea where we started, which is the respecting the humanity and seeing and centering the humanity of all of us, it is only right that we do honor and have those conversations and include the feminisms that make sense for our humanity to thrive.
Thank you. Aminata, do you want to say, or should we, or do I have permission to move to a next question?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
Okay, good. I just, in the interest of time, I just want to make sure that we get all of these in. So the next question has to do with interventions, right? What interventions is African feminism or feminisms? I think we've agreed that there is an African feminisms making.
Yeah.
How is African feminisms conversing or dialoguing with the study of the worldwide African diaspora? And I think, Teresa, you already started on that in your last answer.
Yes, the question of African feminism's intervention. I'm just going to start my remarks with a quote or paraphrasing Steve Biko's point that Africa will give the world the human face. So from that premise, I think African feminisms have the capacity to theorize the most important and the most outrageous forms of violence that gendered person can come under. What do I mean by that? Let's take, for example, the Ivory Coast. What does it mean to theorize access to contraception? When your country's programs are being funded by international donors. When I was back home in July, I saw one of those big banners with, campaign banners for campaigns again, for contraceptions. And you have USAID, you have the British Council, you have the French this and that. These are international entities funding, quote unquote, my access to contraception. So how do we theorize that? And I think, for example, going from that specific location, the theorization of Ivorian feminism will illuminate, theorization in other contexts. Or what does it mean when, for example, the Minister of Education, when she was responding to the high rate of teenage pregnancies, said to the girls, close your legs. And how do you theorize that? When we know that in the United States, a congressman made a similar remark and he was scathingly criticized. So for me, African feminism has the capacity to be really granular, to be attentive to all these differences, all these failings, so that we can offer the world a more comprehensive understanding of what women are going through, or how and what they can achieve, and how they're achieving it. But I have to say that to hear the minister say, close your legs to the girls who are one more time charged and burdened with the responsibility to right wrongs, what do we make of the teachers who impregnate these girls? What do we make of males and boys? Why are they not being held responsible in just not only the social, but also the juridical sense? So for me, Feminism Africa really have a lot to teach. We have a lot to offer.
Wonderful.
Yeah, the last comment that you were making, Professor Jabate, that was reminding me of in Mali, there's often this, not really a debate, but one of these expressions that you hear going around the universities is STGs, like sexually transmittable grades. And I find it such a horrifically sanitized way of talking about, the way these professors operate in a lot of like school environments and university environments in Mali. And it's sort of like discussed, but not really tackled at any, policy level, but also not really seen as something that should be described as something predatory, right? It's just kind of like, a fact of life. And, these girls, that's how they acquire these type of grades. So definitely a lot of work to be done there. I think we lost Wando. Well, I'm sure she'll hop back on. I wanted to address the other part of her question that was about how is African feminisms conversing or dialoguing with the study of the worldwide African diaspora? And I think there's definitely a lot of people doing that work or who have been doing that work. And I wanted to talk in particular about two scholars who are doing that work right now. So one is Yata Kiazolu, who is writing about the transnational solidarity networks, and I'll drop the names in the chat in a minute. She's writing about the transnational solidarity networks between the NCNW in the US, the National Council on Negro Women, and African women decolonial activists, and how they worked across borders to form all kinds of networks, like political networks, intellectual networks, and how that shows us like a different aspect to both the civil rights struggles in the US and decolonization on the continent. Or Marius Kothor, which I'm sure many of you know, or at least if you're on Twitter, you should know, who's writing about histories of female traders in Togo, the famous Nana bands who were trading across borders. And yeah, what's really new and innovative is that she's showing how these women who are usually talked about for their trading activity, she's showing really their anti-colonial activism in West Africa and their entanglements with Black internationalist networks. And she's working with sources also that, like textile, cloth, material culture to kind of like engage these type of histories. So those were just two examples. And again, I'll drop the name, but I think there's definitely a lot of conversations happening and outside also of just narrowly history, but there's a lot of like dialogue and conversing happening between African feminisms and the study of the worldwide African diaspora.
I think we, do we want to address the questions in some of the questions in the Q&A and chat? Oh, there's Bryce, I'll be quiet.
Hi, everyone. Well, real quick, I do want to ask one quick question for you all from the set of questions we circulated before we get to the audience's Q&A. And folks, if in the audience, if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A box. But I think there's a really important question that we have, which is the last one, so we're going to skip to that. Is I'm now going to ask you to each imagine an African feminist future. What might it look like? And in what directions do you see African feminisms going in the near and long-term future?
I can try to go. That's probably the question I struggled with the most, because there's a lot that could be said, but I think, bear with me, I'm going to try to make sense. I think one direction where I think it is going, and it would be good to see it keep going further, is to really mobilize and use African feminisms to fight sort of this movement that I think we see in many parts of the continent right now, of a form of like African nationalism that is quite reactionary, that is quite exclusionary, and that often claims a certain vision of African history to justify itself. So I'm thinking, for example, about what's happening in Ghana with the anti-LGBTQ law, and how very often, but it's not just the case in Ghana. I mean, you see a lot of these discussions in Senegal, sometimes in Mali. Very often what you'll hear people say is that those are foreign imports. These other ideas about gender, about sexuality, are foreign imports, or Western imports. Our history doesn't teach us that, it teaches us something else. So certainly I think one direction where I see African feminism going in the future, because you see feminists in all these contexts really pushing back against that, thankfully, is really helping us think beyond this kind of like nationalism that claims a certain kind of African identity based on the past, and it's often fake or fraught notions of the past, to fight against certain concepts and certain ideas that relate to gender, that relate to sexuality, and overall just to oppress certain categories of people more. So I think if we can use African feminism for that, and I hope I made sense as I was talking. If not, please let me know. That's really would be, I think, a really fruitful direction in the future.
Yeah, fantastic.
Bryce, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize. I'm in my office and I think the internet went off at MSU. So I called back through my phone, and I don't know that you can see me, but I apologize for that.
It's fine.
Okay, so we were at, and I heard just the last bit of Medina's response. I don't know if anybody else wanted to address this or.
Yes, I would like to quickly make the point that I'm worried about the future of African feminisms. Feminism typifies hope, but I'm a little bit worried about African feminisms because of the burden that is being placed on them. Because for one segment of the population to be the vanguard of change, to be burdened with the task of righting wrongs, for me is a reflection of what the Minister of Education was just doing. So for example, to go back to the point of foreign countries and donors funding my birth control in the Ivory Coast, this is, how should we theorize this as a battle for feminism? Is that a battle that feminism should take on, that Ivorian feminism should take on? Because here we're talking about the mismanagement of resources. If these resources was being managed in a proper way, the Ivorian government would not be banking on international institutions to fund birth control programs. So for me to have feminism shoulder all these different battles means that we do not allow ourselves to make mistakes. One, feminisms have to be ethical, they have to be moral, they have to take on the burden of the world, and I think that's asking feminism too much. So the question that we see in popular media, in academia, is the trend toward a freer sexual expression, freer sexual practices, and also the upholding of pleasure as a women's right issue. So those are interesting development, but at the same time, that means that the collective struggle will need to take the backseat for the individual expression. What if on the continent is like Beyonce? My feminism allows me to wear high heels and skimpy clothes and dance. That's my feminism. And our understanding of feminism should be able to accommodate those individually oriented visions of themselves and of the world. So.
Well, thank you. I will move on to the next question. Again, just being conscious of time. It's 4:25. And the next question is about African feminisms being in conversation with Black feminisms, womanism, or other African-derived feminisms in the diaspora. So how is African feminisms in conversation with Black feminisms, womanism, and other African-derived feminisms in the diaspora? Where are the points of connection and where are the points of departure? And if you could just please jump in, because unfortunately, because I'm on my iPhone, I can't see everybody anymore. so I can't, I don't know who's wanting to speak.
I know I had my hand up, but it was for
yeah.
the previous, it was for the previous question, but, and I'll answer this very briefly in saying that, and it's something that we haven't really touched upon as much on this panel, but I think that the discussion, the point of contention is gender and sexuality. That the question of that, I think that that question right there is where you see, and I think because not that it's a new concept or it's a new, we have newer understandings and diverse ways to understanding depending on where we are as the diaspora. And so I think that that is the current point of contention if we're talking about African feminisms. I think because they're if we look at culture and certain traditions, not across the board, but I think the conversation definitely needs to be more nuanced as it relates to gender identities and sexualities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I'll just add a little bit, which is I do think we also have to be quite frank and honest in that there have been times when there has been far more of a commitment to solidarity than there is today. And I think that third world feminism, some of the stories like Medina Cham was reminding us of, those were a moment that really I think has ebbed. And so when we're talking about African feminisms and talking about just the access to birth control, right? Or the access to clean water, or very basic thing, access to menstrual products, right? Those are not the same questions that are happening in the global north among Black feminists, but they have a salience, right? That I think one of the real problems in feminisms in academia, and I really admire my co-panelists who are much more involved in on the ground activism. But the problem is that we, even when we say we need to think about class, we really don't. And the people who are left out of the conversations for the most part, including as historical actors, are people who have very limited means. And so solidarity, I think, really has to mean paying attention to. It means having an ethical relationship to, answering for our privilege, right? So I think of probably all of us in some ways are both, you know, part of being Black American and of being African feminists. Like we exist in all of these places, and we have a different perspective as well. I certainly feel that way, having left Zimbabwe in 1993. So I think even for us to think about how are we positioned to work in solidarity with our colleagues on the continent is really important, to things like just access to journal articles, but at the same time to try and think about how do we build coalitions and really think about what Black feminisms in the global North have to contribute and to learn from, to be honest, from African feminisms. That these are actually not conversations that happen enough and not relationships that are sustained enough. And I feel that that's probably not a welcome thing to say in certain spaces, but I think it's true. It's really true. So, yeah.
Dr. Achebe, are you able to see the Q&A from the audience? You are muted again. Let's go ahead and, folks, let's go ahead and transition to the audience Q&A. That's all right. So we have one question from Selena Gisa.
Thanks, Bryce. I can't see the questions.
Okay, I'll step in and facilitate. We have a question from Selena Gisa, who says, can the panelists speak to what might be particular to what African agents, context studies bring to theorizing the relationship between gender and sexuality. I'm thinking about how womanism is often centered as what African feminism contributes to global feminist ideas. But how then do we think about those not identified as or beyond the category of women that African feminism can speak to? Yes.
Okay, I mean, thank you for that question. And it's very unfortunate that concept of that theory of womanism, which frames African women as fundamentally different from other women, it is that which troubles. Because my understanding of various trends of African feminism is that they have put forward that children are important to African women, that African women are never complete until they have their children, that they cannot take a picture without having their children next to them. So understanding that motherhood and that, womanhood with the understanding of motherhood and marriage, because we're not just talking about women here, we're talking about womanhood, which next to which you will have motherhood. So it's unfortunate that it is that which troubles, that for which African feminism is mostly known for outside of the continent. And as you know, when we get granular, very few African women think of their children as integral to their beings, just like elsewhere. So it's just, of course, it doesn't make much sense that the concept of woman will be so obliterating to other ways of being on the continent. So.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Questions or somebody else that wants to, again, I mightn't be the best person to, just because I can't see the screen. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that question? Okay. Bryce, are there other questions?
Yes, we have two more. The next one is from Kyle Mays, says, thank you for this wonderful conversation. Does the concept of indigeneity have any importance or relationship in discussions of African feminisms? Go ahead, hop in, anybody.
I can hop in. I think some of the ways in which indigeneity and indigenous struggles are being articulated in other parts of the world are really important nodes of intersection and spaces to theorize together. I do think that in many respects, when one does invoke other philosophical and cosmological viewpoints that are what are sometimes called traditional, but are indigenous philosophies, I would say, that we are trying to think about these. And that's why, for example, when I refer to Vanyemba, it's because that's an indigenous way of knowing that was overwritten by colonial and missionary discourses. And part of the process of decolonizing and decolonial thinking is reclaim these ways of knowing as valuable and authorized in and of themselves. That's not to say, again, that those ways of knowing are fixed or are not historically dynamic, but it is to say that we live in all sorts of institutional structures that function to marginalize indigenous philosophies, But it's also, I think, not necessarily the same, well, it's not the same framework, right? The movement for Indigenous rights in a place like the US or in Latin America has its own history, right? So I think that there are ways to intersect that do make it useful, including as another way to become more granular, to be able to recognize the specificities of one's own location and therefore one's own struggles.
Dr. Lima Neves, you have your hand up, and then afterwards, Scholar Theon.
Sure. And I go back to what Medina Thiam has talked about in terms of telling stories. I think we don't, there's this move now to just really see the stories of our elders, or even, you know, our grandparents or our parents, and the value in recording these stories, right? Because academia has told us before that those stories are not necessarily factual history. And there's all this pushback against that, saying that this is the history of the people and those who lived in these lands. And to Cece's point, the idea that, you know, our history belongs to us, and that it's not always, I would say, in many instances, fabricated in academia as well as journals. But for example, in my recent book, where I'm principal author of Crioulas Poderosas, what we do is bring together 21 authors, most of which are not academics, actually, although as principal author, myself and Dr. Amina Pilgrim, we are academics, but we bring together 21 authors that are community activists, those who are of professional, who are in higher ed in other capacities, as well as nonprofit workers who are telling these stories. And these stories are just as important because they belong to the people. And so once we start talking about and really giving validity to the people's stories, the people that are indigenous to these places, and I talk a lot about the Cabo Verdean diaspora, because Cabo Verde does not exist without its diaspora, and the diaspora does not exist without Cabo Verde. And there are women even in Cabo Verde, such as Celeste Forts, who are doing the work to bring this history to life, the history of the women who were involved in the liberation movement, similar to what my other African colleagues have said here, that the books and the stories and all of the accolades have been given to the men, right? To the men who are in the movement, and the women's stories have been rendered invisible. And so there is that move now to just really talk about that. So centering the people's stories and decolonizing that, the ways that that we're passing the information from generation to generation, creating that bridge and continuing the legacy is going to be extremely important as far as African feminisms is concerned.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch also on this question of indigeneity, because I think also relating back to what Cece was saying earlier, I think looking into, doing more serious work into these indigenous histories in Africa, like on the continent, right now there's a lot of, you see indigenous challenges to the nation states in several parts of the continent. I'm thinking about Ethiopia because we're hearing about it a lot right now, but other parts of the continent as well. That may be also one of the ways in which African feminism can help build more solidarity, like across class, and towards those who have less means, who are more neglected by their nation states, and help elevate these stories by taking this approach to trying to really dig into these indigenous knowledges, indigenous ways of seeing, and ways of conceiving of the continent that don't necessarily involve these nationalisms that we were talking about. So I think, to basically answer Kyle's question, I think it was Kyle, yes. I think there's a lot of conversations to be had between African feminisms and in relationship with indigeneity, indigenous knowledge, and particularly indigenous ways of like, you know, conceiving of society and living together that don't necessarily involve again, these nationalist visions that that I think we're talking about more and more on the continent.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very robust concept in terms of it's a robust concept, indigeneity in these contexts. And my point is to invite us to be a little bit more expensive in our definition of indigeneity, because typically it's used to stand in contrast with the West. So in, you know, colonization and imperialism from the West as the dominant ways of responding to the world. Well, we can also think about indigeneity within the African context, because there were also internal colonizations within the African context. Or we have we had interaction, for example, the Sahel with the Arab world centuries before, you know, contact with the West. So when we think about indigeneity in the Malenko context, what are we talking about? At this point, it's very, very difficult for me as a Malenko scholar and a woman of, you know, a Malenko woman to think about what is indigenous to that part of my world. It's very difficult. For example, a friend, she's originally from Brazil. She lived here in the US and she wanted to name her daughter, you know, using an African name. And she asked me, can you find, and I asked my parents, what are the names that are indigenous to the Malenke people of Northern Ivory Coast? And all the names they were giving me were Arabized names. Like my name is not, that is of Arabic origin. So I was telling my friend, sorry, we may have to reach out to some other ethnic groups, but the Malenke of the Ivory Coast have very little to draw in terms of the indigenous ways of being. So my point is, can we think about indigeneity outside of the West and not look at the West as if framing that, you know, question, but to be a little bit more inclusive?
Yeah.
Wow, what an amazing set of and diverse answers to such a complex question, right? I think that's a fantastic way to go ahead and close our panel. Folks, if you were an attendee, can we please give them a big round of applause for these amazing scholars dropping all these knowledge bombs on us today? Thank you so much, folks. As I noted earlier, we will post the video on our YouTube page and we will tweak that out. Thank you so much, folks. And thank you to our wonderful panelists and of course, our moderator.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Achebe, Cici, Teresa, Medina. Oh, Bryce, of course, Bryce.
Thank you all. It was nice to see you and meet you.
Yeah, it was great to meet everyone and see everyone. Thank you so much. It's a great discussion.
Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you.